Hi everyone, it's Laura and I hope you're all doing really well. Today I'm bringing you one of my favourite videos to film, one of my favourite videos to watch, and that is my favourite books that I read last year. My watch later list on YouTube is currently chock full of other people's best books of 2020 and I just can't wait to get to them slowly but surely, because I just love knowing that these are all books that people really recommend, like wholeheartedly recommend out of everything they read, and booktubers do read a lot. These are the best ones. So I have top 10 books for you here today, but they're not really in an order outside of that 10. There happens to be 5 fiction and 5 non-fiction, which I don't know if that's interesting, but that's the only stat I have to give you. So we might go in a fiction book, non-fiction book kind of order, perhaps, just to shake things up. But yeah, there's no favourite, I don't think, out of all of these, because I enjoyed them for different reasons, and especially with non-fiction, sometimes you enjoy it for the content. It's quite difficult to compare, so just assume that all of these are fantastic and you should read them. We'll start with the non-fiction, which was actually what I most recently read, and that's It's Not About the Burka, which is a collection of essays by different Muslim women edited by Mariam Khan. I listened to this on audiobook and I would highly recommend that. That really added something to this collection, because each essay is read by the contributor who wrote it. There are 12 essays in this collection, as varied as the women who wrote them. A lot of the women are based in the UK, but not all of them. And it's just about whatever they wanted to write about, essentially, about what it's like being a Muslim woman, mostly living in the Western world as well, and the kind of things that have come up in that. Some of them talk about their families, some of them talk about struggles at work. One of the themes that came up a couple of times, which I thought was really interesting, is trying to talk about things like feminism or sexism within the context of a Muslim community, or indeed a Pakistani community, for example, something like more specifically, and within a kind of Western society. And many of these women seem to have found themselves in the middle, not really being accepted by either party. So you're kind of stuck between, if you want to talk about sexism in wider society, a lot of feminists would not kind of be inclusive to Muslim women, because they say, well, you're oppressing yourself, you're wearing a headscarf and your society's sexist, so you can't talk about sexism in the wider world. And on the other side, if they talk about sexisms that specifically arise within a patriarchal society, which is often cultural rather than to do with the religion, you then might get a lot of people agreeing with you, but because they're racist, like a lot of kind of white men, and we've seen it a lot in the UK with people like Tommy Robinson, are very anti-Muslim men because they say they're sexist. Like that's the thing, or they say that they're preying on young women. And it almost feels like you're selling out your culture to these white supremacists, which is not the side that anybody wants to be on. And how difficult it is to get people to listen to you about any kind of issues in the world, about any kind of thoughts or opinions that you may have, without them categorising you into a specific box, or as like terrorist or oppressed Muslim women or whatever it is, and how much that they're stereotyped, and how difficult it is to get their actual individual voices out there, which is what this collection does very well. Jumping over to fiction, we have The Heart's Invisible Furies by John Boyne. This is essentially the story of Irish Catholic guilt and how it looks at sex and sexual behaviour, both in terms of unmarried teenagers, young women having sex, and also the homophobia within that kind of institution. And we see this through 2 lenses. One, our main character, who is a gay man growing up in Ireland, having been adopted, what his relationship is like with his adoptive parents, but then also kind of what it's like to be a gay man in Ireland at that time. I think he's born in maybe the 50s, and it starts around then, and then we move up into modern times. It might have been a bit later than that. But then we also have the story of his mother, who was pregnant at 16, unmarried, and having to give him up for adoption, and what that was like for her. And this is one of those stories that unfolds and flourishes kind of throughout this guy's life, and it deals with a lot of traumatic events, from him feeling so kind of oppressed and being in denial about his life in Ireland, to him leaving Ireland and going to Europe and really kind of embracing that gay life. We go through the AIDS crisis, there's homophobic abuse like throughout it, and we go to New York at one point, I think. But through all of that, it's actually very funny, and the characters are very warm, and a lot of them quite eccentric, and I found their conversations so hilarious, and it really shows these characters finding joy in life, even though life has dealt them a handful of shit, and they make bad decisions. And what's so interesting as you see these lives unfolding, is that you see in the future them looking back at their bad decisions or terrible things they've done, and kind of being able to joke about it, and that is what happens with some people, and I really loved that development. The ending is very, like, for me, I was like, this is quite sickly sweet. This is almost like too perfect, this ending, like this is so nice. But the journey, you know, I went with it. The journey was so good, it was worth it. And yeah, I think if you like a book where you really get into the characters and you feel like they're real and you're with them for a very long time, then this is definitely the one for you. The next non-fiction I have is actually the first book I listened to, the first book I finished in 2020, and that was Pride and Prejudice by Gabrielle Jackson. And this is something that I think about a lot. Like, I feel like this has really affected my perspective on how I think about pain, women's pain in particular, and then also how women are treated within the wider medical community. So Gabrielle Jackson was diagnosed with endometriosis, and I think actually some other forms of chronic pain, pelvic pain as well. And it took years for her to get that diagnosis. And it's only once she found out about it, she started researching cases of it, wrote an article for it in the newspaper, and had so many responses from women about their pain, about their journey with endometriosis and getting diagnosed with things like that. And that's where this book came from. So it is part autobiography, but then also part looking at basically women's medical history throughout the ages. And in some parts of the book, I would think, where is this going? Like, she'd really widen her net sometimes. I remember one chapter she started talking about the Madonna whore complex, and I was like, okay, where are we going with this now? I thought we were talking about like the health service, but she always kind of brings it back, and it does make a lot of sense. She goes right back in time to how women were diagnosed with hysteria and what that meant, and how even men and women at the time might present with exactly the same symptoms, and a man would be diagnosed with depression or melancholia, and a woman would be diagnosed with hysteria, and how the way the medical community views women as opposed to men really hasn't moved on. A lot of women's symptoms are thought to be psychosomatic. The vast majority of medical studies are done solely on men, apart from if they're studies about the uterus, about childbirth or something. So for example, she might cite a study on heart disease where all of the test subjects are men, which means that doctors then are unprepared to see women presenting with different symptoms, and they're less likely to diagnose heart failure or a heart attack in a woman just because her symptoms present very differently to a man. And there's just countless examples of this. And apart from all the historical side of it, which I found fascinating, I thought it was really interesting how she said women are more likely to be diagnosed with kind of chronic pain in all kinds of forms, and how that's not really been researched, and some chronic pain things might actually be linked in ways that we don't really understand. There's, like she said, things like endometriosis and IBS might be linked, but it's kind of not really been studied. And apologies, because I did listen to this on audiobook, but I listened to it a long while ago, so I might be giving like slightly incorrect information, but that's the kind of thing I can remember. And yeah, it was just really interesting. It made me so angry but also it really opened my eyes. I just think it is fantastic. I couldn't recommend it enough. A book I haven't been able to stop raving about this year was Black Flamingo by Dean Atter and illustrated by Anshika Kalar. This is a YA book written in verse, and it's just so beautiful. I just loved it. I thought the poetry was just gorgeous, and I really loved all the themes it dealt with, and it just makes me so happy that teenagers have this book. This is the life of a young boy growing up in the UK. He's gay, he's mixed race, and he's dealing with so many different forms of conflict within his identity, and the way this book brings those together is just so beautiful. So for example, he's mixed race, so's his sister, but his mother is white and neither of the children live with their fathers, so it's kind of his identity within that family, the fact that he is close to his father's family but not his father. Then as he grows into puberty and becomes more aware of his sexuality, it's then reconciling the fact that if he were to go back to Jamaica or visit some of his extended family or whatever, they would be extremely homophobic over there, and they're not feeling kind of accepted for that part of who he is. And then just other things like the fact his mother is white but she's actually Greek Cypriot, but because she wanted her children to not feel different at school, she only spoke to them in English. So then when they visit their maternal grandparents, they can't actually communicate to them because they can't speak Greek. And it's just all these little different parts of his world where he feels like he doesn't really fit in anywhere. And the story progresses to him going to university, and getting involved in the drag scene as well, which is where kind of Black Flamingo comes from. I think the one thing I would say in this book is that you get told in the blurb and kind of on the cover that he's going to be doing drag as like the Black Flamingo, and that happens like more than 3/4 of the way through the book. Like it really is much more about his childhood, being at school, growing up, then getting to university and coming into his own there. So the pacing might be a little bit off balance, but I just loved it. I sped through it. The illustrations were really gorgeous as well. And it felt like it dealt with a lot of different issues, different ideas in terms of identity, but it also felt really joyful. And I just think as I said, makes me so happy that teenagers these days have that book that they can read. And at the other end of the spectrum, we have a book which did not make me happy at all. It made me very angry. And I've just realised, looking at this list, that all of these books are like issue books. I'm just like, oh, Lauren, why can't you read something just light and fluffy? But these are important and I love them so much. This was Inside This Place, Not Of It, which is a collection of interviews by different women who've been in the prison system in the US. So some of the women are still incarcerated when they were being interviewed, and some of them had already left prison. And it's just about their experiences, about why they went to prison in the first place, and then what it was like for them in there. And if this doesn't make you like incensed with the idea of the prison system, like I don't know what would. It is focused on the US prison system, which is different to here, and in terms of sentencing, the sentencing out there is very severe. But in terms of the experience in prisons, I doubt it's that much different. A lot of these women were imprisoned for such long times for crimes that really, you know, didn't have that much to do with. Some of them were just accessories to violent crimes. Some of them were just the girlfriend of somebody who committed crimes. And, you know, they get years in prison for that. And then just the abuse of power all the way through the system was just very shocking. The kind of retaliation policy, like if anybody spoke up about mistreatment, the way the guards would then retaliate is really awful. The sexual abuse from guards and from doctors and all over the shop. It's just incredibly upsetting, and it almost feels like you're reading a dystopian novel, like they just don't have any power. There was one woman where I think her situation was when she finally went up for parole, the judge couldn't believe she'd been in prison so long because people had been keeping information from her, and she should have been up for parole like ages earlier than that. And it feels like they're playing mind games with the prisoners and not allowing them to kind of have any kind of say in terms of their daily lives or speak up about where there is mistreatment. And my goodness, it just feels terrifying, the idea you could be that vulnerable. But I would say this is such a necessary read, and you know, maybe it's something where you read one of the essays and then put it away for a little bit and then read another one later on, because it can feel quite overwhelming if you read them all in one go. But it's just so important, I think, to hear about these stories. Such a Fun Age by Kylie Reid has been everywhere. It was very hyped up, and for me, it really was worth the hype. For some reason, I feel like Such a Fun Age and The Vanishing Half by Brit Bennett were quite similar books, and they're not at all. I don't know why I think this, but they both kind of deal with themes of race within them, and they were both kind of literary books which were also very commercial, and they both had a lot of hype around them. I did really enjoy The Vanishing Half, but something about it left me more impressed with it than really hit emotionally. Like at the end of it, I really wanted to love it, and I think I just came away from it going, well, that was very good, but you know, I didn't feel anything. Whereas in Such a Fun Age, I loved that this was so well written, so interesting, with the different themes and things that she's examining. But also, it was so fun. It just read so quickly. I feel like the characters were fully developed, and it felt like you're just reading kind of commercial fiction, which really, for me, is how I think literary fiction should be judged. Like, it should be judged on readability, not just on what the author is doing. Because not everything is a literary experiment. There is a reader at the end of the day, and I think it's very clever when you're able to do everything a literary fiction novel can do, and also just make it really, really fun. As you've probably heard, this is about a young black girl who's the nanny for a white family. Something happens in the family one evening, and she has to sort of on the cuff take the young daughter, who I think maybe is 2 or 3, to the grocery store down the road just to get her out of the house. And she's not really dressed up as a nanny. She looks like she's going out, and she's just hanging out there quite late at night with a young white girl. And somebody complains. They start questioning her, and they have to get the child's father to come along, and all of this gets filmed on somebody's phone. So this is kind of the catalyst for what happens for the rest of the book, but that event itself isn't that transformative. Even though Amira is our main character, and this is what I loved about the book, she really is the centre. And for her, that kind of racist incident happens all the time, didn't really affect her. But it's really about how all these white people in her life define themselves via their relationship to her. And it's really about performative wokeness. You can see it on her boyfriend, you can see it from her employers, and how they're not really listening to her. They're trying to do what's best for her, but they're not really listening to what she actually wants and what she actually needs. And it's so intricate. And I love just seeing how these characters, like, you get their backstories and seeing how their relationships unfold and how they change. And considering she's the centre of it and almost really the catalyst for everybody else's life changing around her, I felt like Amira was such like a specific personality as well. And I think you do lose that sometimes when you have one character who's like almost the blank, if that makes sense. There's a character who's just the centre and everyone else are kind of a little bit more eccentric around them, but I felt like I really knew who Amira was, and I really loved that. Everybody felt so fully fleshed out. I really believed everything that was happening, and I just couldn't stop reading. I had to see how this was going to play out, especially as it got towards the end. I was just like, I need to understand how this is going to end. Yeah, absolutely loved it. Another book I have absolutely raved about to friends is The Cutout Girl by Bart Van Es. This is sort of a biography, sort of an autobiography. It's so fascinating. Bart Van Es is exploring his own family's history, with its main focus being on Lien, who was a young Jewish girl in the Netherlands who got placed with his family during the Second World War. She was hidden amongst his family, and then after the Second World War continued to live with them almost like an adopted sister. But something happened at some point when they were adults, and Lien didn't speak to the family again, that she was cut off. And so Bart Van Es is kind of investigating his family via getting in contact with Lien and seeing her whole kind of family history. And he also puts himself in the story as well, but in a way that's so skillful. And I particularly liked how carefully he handles all the different narratives and the different people that he's dealing with. I think if you're investigating your own family, that can be quite difficult to have some distance from it, and perhaps you can get self-indulgent for some stories. And perhaps take sides in others, potentially. And he really manages to handle everyone's stories so carefully, and he will make it very clear, even in the narrative, like he will write a story, something that Lien went through, as if it's fiction almost, and he'll recreate what he thinks happened in her life. And then he'll make it clear that he's like, Lien's just read back what I've written and she thinks I've made it too dramatic, for example. But because Lien went through so much trauma, there are really distinct gaps in her memories. So he makes it quite clear where he's trying to fill those gaps in, and also where Lien might say one thing and his grandmother would say something else, and he just sort of gives you both versions and doesn't kind of say that one takes precedent over the other, and that almost makes it sound like it's some kind of academic experiment, and it really isn't. You're getting the story of these people. It has so much heart in it. There's loads of photographs in there, but yeah, I don't read biography that often, to be fair, but this one, it just completely blew me away. Of the biographies I've read, this is hands down the best. So although I said these weren't really in an order, I'm looking at the three I've got left, and I think these might be my top ones. So the next fiction one I have is The Battle Rock by Evie Wilde. This was just amazing to read. One of those books which you think is going to be about one thing, but really it's dealing with so many other issues kind of underlying the surface. Really, this is about violence against women. That's the crux of it. But the way it's done is that there's three different narratives all taking place in the same place, but at different time periods. So we have a woman in the present day who is dealing with the house that her father grew up in. So her father's died and her step-grandmother has died, and she's kind of going through their possessions, getting the sort of house sitting basically before the house is sold. And then we also have the life of her step-grandmother and what it was like marrying this man with two grown boys already and coming to Scotland, which is where they were, which I didn't say earlier. And that's about her life, which is sort of in, I guess, the 50s, around that kind of time, so 40s and 50s. And then we go way back in time as well, with a young girl in that area who is being accused of witchcraft, and this family who are trying to protect her. And there's not really a plot as such as it is an examination of these people's lives, and I really enjoyed how we jumped between, especially the modern day period and the grandmother's period, because you're seeing some events unfold like in real time, I guess, in the grandmother's timeline, and then you might get a spoiler for some of those events almost in the modern day, where people will just refer to an event that happened. So you're sort of piecing together this puzzle in a really strange order, but it works really, really well. And through this family's narrative, we're looking at the male abuse of power, as I said, but also like gaslighting within relationships. We're looking at the idea of witchcraft and female power, and the idea of trying to stifle that, hauntings and ghosts. And I loved how all of these themes were so subtly woven throughout the narrative. It just felt like you were finding out about this family, really. But then in between some of the chapters, there were these little vignettes of random people, but little vignettes of violence. And it builds so slowly, and for me this felt so threatening by the end, even though it's like a really nice, there's lots of humour in it as well, I should add. It felt like you're reading a historical novel on one hand, and kind of a sort of funny, sarcastic Ali Smith novel almost in the modern section, and yet by the end of the book I literally felt like I was reading a thriller, because all the little aspects of violence are so real, they're so small, and they build up, and towards the end I was like, oh my goodness, this has made me scared to like go outside, which I almost feel gives the wrong impression, because it was a very, very enjoyable book. It wasn't like reading a thriller, but yeah, it's just so in awe of how she structured it. So probably my favourite non-fiction book that I read this year, and which actually I also listened to on audiobook, was Black and British by David Olusoga. And this is a history of black people in Britain, basically. But it doesn't just focus on things like the transatlantic slave trade. It really goes right the way back to Roman Britain, and evidence we have of black people in Britain at that time, all the way up kind of to, I guess, about the Windrush era. It doesn't really go that much more modern, which is fair enough. And what I absolutely loved about this book is that it's dealing with, it's a very long book, it's dealing with a lot of content, but it really managed to marry together the wider context of what was happening at different periods in history with individual stories, some individual stories of black people in the UK or in Sierra Leone, for example, and some just of general public feeling, like how we have this perception that people in the past were just racist at all times, and that wasn't really the case. Like, societies changed and developed and waxed and waned, and the amount of black people in Britain changed with what was going on in the world. So in Georgian Britain, for example, there were quite a lot of people, especially in London, and even at the time there were different opinions on these black people, like from like the wider white population. Some people were very worried about the growth of black people, and other people were just like really chill about it and were fine. And I think that was really valuable to see how people's values and ideals and morals changed. It's like these weird hypocrisies that people have even in their own brains, like the cognitive dissonance between what people thought of individual black people and how they thought about slavery in the context of society, was absolutely fascinating. And that's just like one example. It obviously goes through all different parts of history, and I just thought it was so effective the way it combined the historical context, as I said, with individual people's stories. And I think that's the kind of history I like reading and hearing about, because you can really relate to it when it's put into context of a specific person's life, and what they did and the people they were interacting with. So yeah, I just think it's such an accomplished book. It's so comprehensive, and it really helped to give me some perspective on specifically the UK's relationship with Africa, with the African continent, what we did in Africa, and then how we related to African and black people, like just through the ages. And then probably my favourite fiction book that I've read last year was Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo. I'm sure you've heard about this a million times, so I'll try not to rave about it too much, but this is 12 different stories of mostly women, mostly black women, in the UK, or at least kind of linked to the UK, and the stories are told in 3 parts. You always get a daughter and a mother, I think always actually, and then a third person who is linked to them in some way, like a friend or a teacher or something like that. And these stories take place in different times, different locations, different eras, so you really are building up this kind of tapestry of different women. And then as you go on, you realise that more people are linked together than just kind of the threes, the groups of threes that you see at the beginning. And it's just so incredible to see how skillful she writes these characters. And what I particularly liked about it is that you'll be reading about, I don't know, a mother character. You'll be reading her perspective and the way she thinks about her daughter and the way, the way she lives her life. And then you get the daughter's perspective and she'll be like, oh my gosh, she's so embarrassing, or whatever it is. And whoever you're reading, you really understand and you get that. And you might really understand why someone's acting the way they do. And then you hear someone else's perception of that person and you equally understand that. You're like, oh yeah, that is quite annoying. And I loved how even-handed it felt with all of the different characters. She really treated them all with so much respect, no matter who they were, what their views were, kind of what their histories were. And it's one of those books where it's almost, there's no more to it than that. And yet, there is so much in those pages. There's not really an overarching plot or purpose to it that I could explain without kind of giving everything away. But it is just about these different women's lives and just how differently they're raised, all their different viewpoints. And it was such a joy to read this coming together, because there was nothing that particularly linked these women other than the fact that mostly they were black and British. But it almost felt like an orchestra built up of all these different voices. Like everybody's so distinct and yet like creating sort of one sound. There's a metaphor for you. Anyway, I loved it. This has been such a long video to film and I'm sure it will be long even after I've edited it. So, there's probably not much more to say about it that hasn't been said already, but I absolutely loved it and just in awe of it. So as always, all of these books are linked in the description box below if you would like to check them out yourselves, which please do. I highly recommend them. And I would love to hear from you if you've read any of these, what your thoughts were on them and what your favourite books were that you read last year. I read about 80 books last year, which is the most I've ever read in a year. And most of them were in the first half of the year though, and it's quite interesting how the situation of 2020 has affected reading. And so at some points I was absolutely caning it through books, and then at other points didn't want to pick anything up at all. But it has resulted in some absolute pure bangers. I feel a bit like Delia Smith or something, trying to be cool, saying that in this video, but these are the best of the best. So yeah, I think in that sense, it's been a pretty good reading year for me. So on that note, I will have a chat with you about these books and other fantastic reads in the comments below. Bye!